This morning, we have the esteemed pleasure of welcoming our conference keynote speaker, Dr. David Anderson Hooker. A man of cause, passion, and talent, Dr. Hooker comes to us from the University of Notre Dame, where he is a faculty member in the Joan B. Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies and is the professor of the practice of conflict transformation and peace building. Without question, Dr. Hooker's accomplishments are extraordinary. Certainly, at first glance, his CV leaves one in awe. It's actually ridiculous. I meant to say his numerous degrees, his very impactful professional appointments across various criminal justice systems, international and non-governmental organizations, community-based organizations, are truly amazing and worthy of praise. But at second glance, undeniable characteristics emerge. David is a man who is engaged, embedded, and exuberant about using his privilege to leverage real sustainable changes for those who are fighting for equity and for those who seek liberation from racial oppression. He is a risk taker for human good. Please join me in welcoming Dr. David Anderson Hooker.
As a first and right action, and in keeping with regional protocol, I'd like to start by acknowledging the original people on whose land we are currently situated. Greetings to all of my relatives, to the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee. And I honor the sovereignty of the Six Nations, the Mohawk, the Cayuga, Onondaga, the Oneida, the Seneca, and the Tuscarora, and to the Tuscarora and all the bands and remnants of the Iroquois Confederacy. I honor you, I greet you. Greetings to all my relatives. I want to acknowledge and I appreciate Dr. Ward for inviting me and having me come, allow me to participate with you in this process. And Eileen Kine was very helpful. And then I had a brilliant Sherpa this morning who got me every place that I needed to go. At 6:45 a.m. Pacific time yesterday, my day started, all right? I left the hotel where I was staying. I walked the mile and a half to get a cup of coffee, to walk up to the top of the hill, to teach a course on trauma and peace building at the Pacifica Graduate Institute in Depth Psychology. The day ran from 8:15 until 4:30. By the time I got off campus, got on the road, I don't know if you all have ever done this, but I drove down the 101 highway in Los Angeles and got on the 405. And so it takes about 3 hours to go about 60 miles down the 101 across the 405 to get on the to get to LAX. I dropped off a car. I walked fairly briskly to get to a flight. That flight, I fell asleep before the flight took off from LAX. I landed in Buffalo, and then they dropped me off. The taxi dropped me off somewhere over here. So from time to time during the day, you might see me drifting just in and out just a little bit. It's fair, I think, to share with people where you are. And so I just want to let you guys know that's where I am. That being said, I'm glad to be here. I'm excited to be here. As I remember it, the goal of the conference is to focus on ways in which universities, communities, and governments either can, should, shouldn't, do or don't partner to address issues of race, equality, social justice. As a former vice president of community building for the Atlanta civic site, the Annie E. Casey Foundation, I have a lot to talk about in terms of the way that governments and universities relate to communities. It's not always honorable, and so there's a lot to consider in how we think about those partnerships. And then the subtitle, which was really interesting, and the conference is even more interesting to me, which is this whole notion of reconciliation and systems change. And Dr. Ward and I have had this conversation a couple of times, because I asked her, are you inviting me as a community organizer, as a pastor, as a lawyer, as a professor? And she said, I'm inviting a professor. So that's a different conversation, right? Because there are some other conversations we could have, and you all might spark those somehow in some question that you ask. But I'm showing up as a professor today, and here's my first confession. If you ask any of my students, 80% of the students in every class that I've taught for the last 15 years, no less than 80% of them make the same critique. He gives too much work, right? Most of them make three critiques. They'll say, he gives too much work, he's very dismissive of our excuses, really dismissive of our excuses, and he grades too hard, right? On top of their contract, ask for three things: on time, excellence, no whining. Right, those are our agreements. You sign in, you come in, we play. So I typically try to give too much information in a talk like this, and so the way that I'm going to try and resist that is frame the case. This is my intention. I'm going to frame the case and then present just a little bit of a description about one project that I've been involved in since 2010, and then from that project identify a few lessons learned, and then hopefully in just briefly identifying the frameworks for those lessons learned when we all get to, after the two respondents, after Connie and Rose, and we get a chance to do some questions and answers. If any of those frameworks spark your attention or you want questions about them, then we can go deeper in during the questions and answers. Does that work? Okay, I should apologize for this piece. I'm ordained in the Black church tradition, right? And often, when standing and holding forth, you might ask a question, and as a professor, sometimes people will assume that you're just providing rhetoric. I'm trained in the Black church tradition, so I actually expect a response. All right, it's just a bad. So I'm laying out a process. I'm wondering if that's okay. Yeah. Okay, thank you. That's helpful. It's really helpful for me. And so we begin to frame the case with the dissertation on roast pork. In ancient African societies, they were agrarian societies and husband societies, which means that they had crops and they also had herds. Right? They were agrarian and husband societies. And because of the reverence for life, all life coexisted inside of the curtilage. I love that word, the curtilage, right? The markings of their territory. And so the animals, the crops, the human beings all coexisted inside of the curtilage. And in these societies, as you would imagine, they often created rites of passage. And so it came a time where there was a young man, probably about 11, certainly no more than 12 years old, and his rite of passage was to guard the village while the elders went into town for council. And he took his responsibility very seriously. This is going to be his rites of passage. He took his responsibility very seriously, and so he went to the highest point on the roof of the house and he set up watch. And he had his lamp and he sat there and he watched to guard the house. But he was 11 or 12, and so at some point during the course of the night, he nodded off to sleep, and when he nodded off to sleep, he knocked over the lamp. The oil spilled, the fire spread, and the house and the houses connected to it in the village, and all of the crops and most of the animals were also consumed in the fire. It turns out that he was able to get all of the women and children out. And so that was when the elders came back, they said, that's a successful demonstration of your, maturity that you were able to get the women and children out. And then they started poking around in the fire in the remnants to try and figure out what there might be to salvage. And as they were poking around, one of them poked something and it burned his fingers, and as a natural reaction, when his fingers burned, to cool them off, he licked them. And it actually tasted pretty good. And so he poked again, and he licked it. He said, huh. And when he uncovered it, he realized this was the prize work pig that they used. This was the pig that they used to plow and to root out things, and it had been consumed in the fire. All the villagers got together, they helped plant crops, they built new homes, and as a form of celebration, at the end, they carved up the pig. They had never had pig in this community before. They carved up this pig, and they had roast pork for the very first time. From that point, even until today, in that community, anytime they want to have roast pork, they will burn somebody's house down. Which is to say that we have to know why we do what we do, because we may just be trying to create partnerships that move towards celebration, and we can end up burning some of our communities down. So, first point, you have to know why you do what you do, right? And in this climate, with issues of racialized distinction and expectation and lived experience are particularly difficult. So it could be all morning if I just started calling a list of familiar names. Trayvon Martin, Mike Brown, Sandra Bland, Renisha McBride, Tamir Rice, Oscar Grant, John Crawford, Jordan Davis, Philandro Castillo. Or I could talk about certain places: Charleston, North Charleston, Minneapolis, Seattle, Cincinnati, LA, Staten Island. You can talk about all kinds of places. It's true in pure numbers that, at least in the relationship between police and community, more people who perform and live in white political space are killed than are those who are black and brown bodied. And yet, in terms of relative percentages of the population, it's not even close, right? I could take that list in another direction. I could lift up names like Mumia Abu Jamal, Asada Shakur, Rene Gonzalez, Antonio Guerrero, Ramon Labanino, Sami Al-Arian. Do you all know these names? Amina Ali, Hawul Hassan. Do you know these names? The list is actually endless of people whose lives, people who were pursuing justice, had a commitment to their community, or some people who were just trying to live their lives, play in a park, make ends meet selling loose CDs, loose cigarettes, something like this, got their lives snuffed out or significantly impeded. And so we have to ask ourselves, what is it that we do in community to diminish or to mitigate those challenges? Sometimes the individual stories aren't enough, so you could list a whole bunch of statistics. Dr. Ward started giving out these statistics related to access to health care, the suspensions and expulsions of black and brown bodied kids, the number of children who are referred to judicial systems, that so-called cradle to prison pipeline, the number of people who are stopped in search for quality of life expenses, the impacts that are being had on families, the increasing mental health, the destruction of communities, even during the time when we had the so-called first black president, Bill Clinton, not. The policy environment was so harsh and destructive for poor families, for black and brown bodied families, that we have yet to recover. And it seems, if you watch it, that the economy is often doing really well when our communities are struggling. And so we have to ask ourselves, what is there that we might do? This is where that subtitle, Reconciliation and Systems Change, comes in, because that's part of the subject of the conference. And for me, the question of how to talk, how, if at all, could we even think about talking about trust and reconciliation in such a context of a deeply ruptured society? A different question, one that I'm at least willing to lean in on, isn't Should we talk about reconciliation? Or not how will we go about reconciliation, but should we even talk about reconciliation? And people say, this reconciliation thing is hard, it's really ineffective. And I actually think it's both. It's hard, and most often it's ineffective because we choose reconciliation as though relationships will shift systems. We are oppressed and marginalized and constrained by systems, by structural violence, by cultural violence, and yet we think that being in relationship with one another and being able to smile and talk nice to one another and feel good breaking bread together is going to change that. It doesn't change it, and what it does is it allows us to feel good about our relationships in ways that allows us to overlook the ongoing destruction that people are experiencing in their lives. And so I have come to the conclusion that neither truth nor a relationally focused reconciliation are possible. And therefore, we have to consider a different framing or approach when we're trying to figure out how to improve the likelihood of equitable outcomes in our communities. The response that I'm proposing, that I'll talk about a little bit, is a framing. It's based in kind of a narrative theory, but it's grounded in narrative theory. It really focuses on the performativity of our identities, like how do we live in ways. At the end of the day, justice, reconciliation, community should all be about the creating space and context in which each of us as individuals and in groups have the capacity to fully manifest all of the capabilities, to be able to fully live out and make contribution with the gifts and talents and graces that have been extended to us. And so we have to think about that. And so the framing that I want to offer is built in that vein. But to tell you how I got there, I want to talk a little bit about a program that I've been involved in Greensboro, North Carolina for a while, and then based on that, describe 5 or 6 lessons that we learned. So the project is the Greensboro CounterStories project, right? This is a difficult visual. Can you see that? Yes. All right. So, all right. The Greensboro CounterStories project. Why CounterStories? Casual conversations happen at counters, but also Greensboro was the site of the first successful counter sit-in during the civil rights movement. There have been a couple of others, but when the students from North Carolina A&T came and sat in at the Woolworth in downtown Greensboro, they actually had a conversation that began to change something in society. And so we want to have conversations that shift structures, that demand structural change. And so we talk about these counter stories. And so just a real quick description about the process, what we did. We had, let me describe the context of Greensboro first though. Okay, so we have these counter stories. The problem in Greensboro is that since 1955, the police have always seemed to be fully engaged with the larger community and with government interests to squelch any level of protest. Right? And it's not, the police are put out as a front, so they seem to be the problem, but they aren't the problem. The problem is there are so many places where marginalized people, or where people are marginalized, where they are excluded. Ineffective access to health care, food deserts, inequitable educational resources. There are all kinds of ways in which people are marginalized and their full capacities are impeded. And when they want to protest that, it just seems that there is this ready use of force that is available to squelch that protest, no matter how peaceful it is, right? And so we have to pay attention to that. And so we started asking questions about improving police-community relations, but it really was about improving a space of marginalization, or diminishing places and corners in which people experience marginalization. So what did we do? Really quickly, we had a 26-month, I did with one partner, we did 26-month listening. For 26 months, I was living in Atlanta at the time, but for 26 months, Every other week, I would go to Greensboro for 1 to 3 days. I would go to, there were a couple of basketball parks where kids played basketball. I go to the barber shop. I used to have a need to be in a barber shop. I go to barber shops. There was a elder woman who had some mobility challenges. She and I had developed a relationship, and so every other time that I would go up, I would take Miss Rose to get her hair done. And it was wonderful for me because I could just sit in the beauty parlor and listen to what people talked about and listen to what people cared about. And I would go to community town hall meetings and go to all kinds of other meetings and just listen and hear what people were concerned about. And during that time, we developed some other partnerships with Guilford College, with A&T, with Elon at the law school, plus the beloved community center and any number of other community partners. And we engaged the arts community and the business community in preparation for a process that we call transformative community conferencing. There's a little book out there in the world somewhere that describes this process of transformative community conferencing, but at the end of the day, what the transformative community conferencing process does is it identifies dominant narratives and unique narratives that aren't dominant and asks people to make a choice. So the dominant narrative in Greensboro was, repression, exclusion, separation, segregation, fear, isolation, a lack of knowing. But there was also this narrative that was undercurrent of grace and a space and a commitment to community and a commitment to beloved community. And so you have to ask people to make a choice. And once they make the choice, then you ask what are the relationships, resources, and structures needed to change in order to make that choice a habit. This is the thing, we all live inside of stories. You live your life inside of stories. The only way that you can make sense of your life is by the stories that you tell about yourself and the stories that others tell about you. You live your life, and most of those stories are structured around narratives that you don't know anything about. And that's the problem, is that there's narratives contained in your life. How many of you, this is a digression from my talk, how many of you have ever been surprised? Really? Yeah. How many of you have ever been disappointed? You need to know that you could never be disappointed in the present. It is what it is, that's the way it is, and it's that way for one reason only, because that's the way it is. Your disappointment comes because you're living inside of a narrative. You have a narrative, you have an expectation that was created often by something that you don't even pay attention to. Very quick example, still in the midst of a digression, but very quick example. I used to be Assistant Attorney General. I tried a bunch of cases in the state of Georgia, and I was on my way to court in Fulton County. I was on my way to trial in Fulton County, so I've kind of cleaned up. I'm downtown. I go into the McDonald's next to the courthouse, and this is during a time when they would sell 2 cherry pies, for $1. 2 apple pies, 2 cherry pies for $1. I asked 2 cherry pies for $1. And the woman put one pie in the bag, folded the bag very nicely, handed it to me and said, "Have a nice day, sir." Right? I opened the bag and I said, "Ma'am, there's only one pie in here." She turned around, she grabs the box, she squeezes it so I can see the top pop off of the box. She kind of propels it to the bottom, she crumples the bag, she slides it across the counter, and she says, "Have a nice day, next." I was surprised. I was a bit disappointed, right? But the trick is, I don't know her. We haven't had any kind of agreement about how I should be regarded. Now, this is the thing. I consider myself to be a decent Christian person, and so I would never walk out of a store with anything that I didn't pay for, right? That's just kind of, you learn that early on. If you didn't pay for it, you don't walk out of the store with it. I hadn't paid for that level of disrespect, and so I should give it back. I thought, no. But so I said, you know what, this probably isn't going to work between us. May I speak to the manager? The manager comes over, and he says, how can I help you? I explained to him, I asked for 1 cherry pie, 2, I got the second one, it's kind of crushed. I really would like, 2 cherry pies, The manager says, sir, do you have 2 pies in a bag? He turned his back to me and says, have a nice day. Have you ever been surprised or disappointed? What you need to know is that you're living inside of a narrative. And when I called my sister, my younger sister, to talk about it, she says, David, this is the problem. You were expecting 5-star service in a no-star restaurant, right? But that's an expectation. That's a certain humanity that that's a narrative of humanity that you've created. All of us live inside of narratives. Those narratives shape our lives, and sometimes those narratives are formed inside of the agencies that we relate to. So when we show up in school, somebody has an expectation of who we are, right? And they position us as a certain way, and if you act differently from that, then that's a problem for everybody. And often they expect you to not succeed, and if you try to act differently from that, that's a problem for everybody. The school's not designed for that. Anyway. So what you have to do is notice the communities are shaped by these narratives. And so you have to name the dominant narratives and name the kind of unique undercurrent, and then decide which of those narratives you want to live in, and then create relationships, resources, and structures to allow the new narrative, the preferred narrative, to be the narrative that everybody lives in. Second part of the process. We did this exact same thing. We went around doing some listening. We gathered some folks, and we had what I call CounterStories style conversations. And then the long and short of it was we trained members of the movement for Black Lives. We trained members of the Latin Kings and Queens. We trained some college students from Guilford, from A&T, from Elon, a few professors, and we trained active duty police officers. And they went out and co-facilitated 8-week conversations around a really important question. How can we create a Greensboro in which everybody feels safe, protected, and respected? That's a reasonable question. Everybody would want an answer to that. The police would want the same answer to that the local government, that the universities, that the students, that the community activists would want. And it turns out I wasn't in any way interested in what the community members told them. They spent 8 weeks discussing that question. It had no interest to me. The only thing that was interesting to me was what was the process of an active duty police officer when paired with a member of the movement for Black Lives or Latin Kings and Queens or a college student. What were their processes for creating a context in which community could happen? Because that's the real work right there, right? But that was our process. So we did this work, and coming out of the work, it was delicious work. We had some problems, there were some limitations. It wasn't quite as successful as we'd like. But coming out of the work, there were 5 lessons, and I want to talk a bit about those really quickly. I said I'm giving you guys too much information. You getting too much information? No. Okay. So, 5 lessons that we learned. The first lesson is that these are wicked problems. And wicked problems have a particular kind of context. Let's talk about what it means to be a wicked problem. But second lesson is effective partnerships require people-centered critical consciousness. This is really important. This is the work that universities can do. This is the work that universities and community groups can partner to do. Connie will talk a bit about that. But people-centered critical consciousness. I don't know what Connie's going to talk about, but I know that at the Center for Community Concerns at the University of Notre Dame, they do people-centered critical consciousness. So I feel comfortable putting her on the spot. You have to operate with a correct analytical framework. And then we have to fully understand the relationships between power and silence. The problems are wicked problems. So there are some characteristics of the wicked problem, but the basic idea is there's no right or wrong. John Paul Lederach makes this distinction between later, right? We should do that later. John Paul Lederach makes the distinction between solutions and solutions. Most of us go into communities and deal with things like racial equity and poverty thinking that the solution is mathematic, that A plus B equals C. If we do this plus that, we get an outcome. And the reality is their solutions are more aligned with kind of a chemical where if you add a little bit of this and a little bit of that and a little bit of this element, you can produce a result. But you can also get that same result with a different mix. Wicked problems are even more complex than that in the sense that there's no good or bad answer. There's no true or false answer. It's just some tend to be better than others. And there's no template to follow. It's not like we've done it before. It's not like it's been handled before. There's always more than one explanation for the problem, which makes it difficult because every one of you, coming from different disciplines, has a different understanding. If I ask you to make a list, why are people poor? Give me 9 reasons. Why are people poor?
They don't work.
They don't work. Why are people poor?
Uneducated.
They're uneducated. Why are people poor?
Racism.
Racism. Why are people poor?
Trauma.
Huh? Trauma. Why are people poor?
Lack of jobs.
A lack of jobs, which is different from them not working. The economy's not set up for them to be, lack of skills. Okay, so education, skills, trauma, racism, lack of jobs, unwillingness to work. Say again?
The rewards and, more resources going to capital and not to people.
So
Reading money and rich getting.
money is making money and is going to capital, is producing more, but not going down, not getting down to the people. That trickle-down theory hasn't yet proved out, right? We're still waiting. It's trickling. Mental health issues. So this is the thing. I put all of you in a room, and I said we're going to address poverty. And you hear what just happened? We got like 19 different solutions, and all of them may in fact have some aspect of a contribution. None of them are completely correct, and several of them, if you do something about it, it actually will have other consequences that we have to deal with. And so some of our solutions create other problems. This is what makes the problem a wicked problem. Because sometimes when people say, well, we're going to go about building jobs, what they did in Atlanta, they said we're going to go about inviting industry and building jobs. And what I noticed was they did that in my neighborhood. And so they kept gentrifying and moving folks out of my community. And so the black and brown bodied people who were trying to get jobs and didn't have jobs, they said, well, what we're going to do is bring the jobs closer to them. But they didn't notice that they were moving the people out when they did it. A lot of universities do this where they want to get closer to the community, but they don't notice that when they're getting closer to the community, what they're doing is taking up the land and hiking up the prices of the land and taxing the people out of the communities that they otherwise say they want to help. And so there's a way in which wicked problems, one part of the solution or one part of the approach actually creates other problematics. And so it's not like it's easy, it's always a complicated problem. For the most part, wicked problems are unique and they cannot be solved. They can't be fixed. The context can be improved, but the context can also be worsened. And so sometimes trying certain things can actually make the context worse. You can't arrest your way out of a drug epidemic, and you can't deny a drug epidemic. And so quality of life, stop and frisk policing is just as foolish as just say no. So these are wicked problems. Can't be fixed. So you all are at a conference to talk about something that can't be fixed. Good to notice, all right? Good to notice. So, but as you're trying to deal with it, as you're trying to improve the context, second lesson is we need to have people-centered critical consciousness. universities are often complicit in the exploitation of communities because they don't give the same academic credit for research that is people-centered as they do for these kind of nuanced, intellectual, cutting-edge kinds of ways of thinking about things. And they also don't necessarily give credit. Very few universities give credit when the researcher chooses to give the community that they're working with control over their information. If the community says, we get to determine whether this is published and how the science gets interpreted, right? We get to say how you talk about us, you can't get credit for that. Universities won't approve those. How many of you are at universities? How many of you are operating in universities? Will your university approve if what I say in my IRB, my Institutional Review Board application, if I say that the community will ultimately determine how this thing gets interpreted, you're not doing research, right? And so often the advancement strategy for scholars is actually detrimental to the experience of the community. We tried something in Greensboro. We trained multiple people during this process. We trained multiple people around research ethics in the community, around research ethics, and we established an institutional review board in the community. And so any faculty person, any research person that wants to go, you can get your university approval, but you have to go through the community IRB. They have to say whether what you're doing is ethical in their regard, right? Often what it'll do is stop people from coming because they're like, we don't want to deal with it. A lot of people want to be in community, but they don't want to deal with community people. Like, I've got a love for community, but I really don't like these people, all right? People-centered critical consciousness. Critical thinking goes beyond just schooling and literacy to causing people to question the reasons and the consequences for thinking the way that they do. Michel Foucault. We often quote Foucault, he writes knowledge/power as one concept. And when people interpret that, they often say that what Foucault said was knowledge is power. How many of you have found yourself saying knowledge is power? Or listening to somebody who says knowledge is power and you actually accept that as though it's true? What Foucault actually said, he writes knowledge/power, what he actually said is knowledge is the manifestation of power. There are always multiple interpretations, and the one that gets passed down with the imprimatur of truth is based on a power regime that gets to determine what's considered true, what's considered valuable, what's the proper epistemological approach to understanding this context. Knowledge is the manifestation of power, and so critical consciousness is teaching people, critical thinking teaches people what are the consequences of thinking the way that they think. Critical consciousness then takes that critical thinking and applies it to current situations to develop a deeper understanding about concrete realities. This is just a bonus, but there is some research that's emerging that says that universities that have a curriculum where critical thinking and critical consciousness are a central aspect of the curriculum, students of color and students like first-generation college students, and students who are otherwise marginalized tend to do better in those environments. If you invite critical thinking, they tend to do better academically and socially and professionally in that context than they would in a context where critical consciousness is not taught. And so there are a variety of reasons why critical thinking should be part of it. But I also think critical thinking and critical consciousness is part of it in order to know what the product is that we put out. Because in engineering school, there's very little difference in the knowledge base between somebody who would build nuclear power to provide ready resources for energy, for healthcare and industry and lights and all those kinds of things to villages, and the knowledge needed to build thermonuclear warheads. The distinction isn't in the knowledge base, it's in the moral compass and the critical consciousness of the actor. In social work, criminal justice and restorative justice practices and programs and education programs, it's critical consciousness that's going to allow you to know whether you're actually empowering people and dismantling the systems that are structurally violent against marginalized people, or you're just demanding that the people who operate in your systems would trade justice for harmony. In schools of theology and in peace studies programs, it's critical consciousness that will distinguish whether somebody is going out as a missionally driven peace builder or a Bible-toting colonizer. We have a responsibility to demand critical consciousness. If we're going to do these partnerships, they have to be people-centered, they have to be critical conscious, and they have to be people-centered. I would spend a little bit of time talking about this people-centered thing because I really love Ignacio Martin Barro. You guys are in a Catholic university. Do you know Martin Barro? No? A couple of you. See a couple of heads nodding. But Martin Barro is one of the original writers of liberation psychology, El Salvadoran priest, came up in the Oscar Romero school, and he talks about an understanding of the people, because a lot of times politicians and industrialists all say we're doing this for the people. And so he had a different understanding. There's a way of understanding who are the people. And part of the way you want to look at it is historical particularity, political solidarity, and the places where socioeconomic exploitation has created a claim for justice, and understand who are the people. But anyway, we have to have a people-centered critical consciousness. Universities can do that, communities can help to make sure they do that, and the students who go out will be better situated if we would. Wicked problems need people-centered critical consciousness, and we also need a proper analytical framework. I'm not going to talk about either of these, but you should know Bronfenbrenner's ecological analysis. Like, when you see someone, you categorize them. You make meaning of them. You make meaning of their lives. And that happens in every aspect of somebody's being. So it's not like if you just change one dimension of their life, you may have slightly changed the trajectory of their life, but if they are being addressed and positioned in ways in all of these different institutions that they relate to, in both at the family level, in social services, in church and education, and police services, and this happens over time. So if you don't know the Bronfenbrenner ecological model, it would be helpful because it will also help you to know who you need to be partnering with in your work. You can't do education work effectively without also knowing what the nutrition issues are. Children who come to school hungry, children who come to school malnourished aren't as effective learners. Everybody knows that. But they also tend to be more reactive, which means that then you have to connect them to justice systems in inappropriate ways. You have to construct discipline that acknowledges their context. And so knowing all of these other partners and places where the child exists, where the person exists, knowing their ecology, studying it not from your context but from theirs, is an important part of the analysis, which is why we brought together 45 boundary-spanning leaders from different aspects of the community to have these conversations. The other part of your analysis has to be a nested theory. Mari Dugan has a nested theory. John Paul Lederach, Jerem Sawatsky expanded it. Oh, no, that's not helpful. Is that a pointer? That is a pointer. So this is what Mari Dugan's nested theory says, is that issues that are experienced at the individual level have impacts at the relational level, which means they also inform what's happening at the subsystem, which could be family, which could be community, which could be organization, the larger system. So in international peace building, we think about this as kind of family, community, larger society, national, international. And then John Paul Lederach helped us to think that issues that are happening immediately at this time Many of them have their genesis in what has happened in the last decade, in the last generation, in the last era, in the last age. And when you're doing your work in response, you have to do work. Somebody is doing work that's responding to the crisis, to the immediate point. Somebody has to be doing work around the same issues, but that it's going to have a 10-year impact. It's going to have a generational impact. It's going to have the impact over an era, impact over an age. How many of you are doing work right now that has a 50-year impact? Is designed to have a 50-year impact? I apologize. Early on, I might have mentioned to you, I'm ordained in the black church tradition, right? So I'm actually inviting a conversation. 50-year impact.
We can only hope.
Well, no.
Not planned.
No. Hope is a wonderful thing. I'm all for hope. Hope and change. I love that stuff. How many of you have a planned impact? How many of you have a planned generational strategy? Let's go to, okay, maybe 50 years is a bit too much. A planned generational strategy. Not funding, but you've set in motion something and you understand that this is a generational strategy. This isn't something that, because if it's a generational strategy, then to evaluate your intervention fairly, you can't evaluate it as though something's going to happen now. Most of us, because of the way that we get funded and the way that we understand our own precarity in our employment situations and in our communities, most of us do crisis work. And crisis work can't undo multi-generational transmission of trauma and structural, and crisis doesn't undo structural violence. Crisis work doesn't undo cultural violence. Who is shifting the narrative? Who's working on changing the narratives about who people are? Because that's the work. And so if you're doing crisis work, at the very least, you've got to partner with somebody who's got decade-based strategies, somebody who's got generational strategies, somebody who's got strategies that impact over the era or the age, and then align your work so that you all are doing the same thing, or you're at least working towards the same aim, even if you're not working together. You can work in silos if you have a partnered understanding with others who are doing the work later on. Anybody work at the Boys and Girls Club or YMCA or something like that? That kind of a project? Yeah? Who do you pass the children off to when they age out of the Boys and Girls Club?
I don't know where they're going.
Yeah, I know.
Passing them off, no.
Hope and change is a really important component. It is not a transformation strategy. It is not a theory of change. We hope that there are some other folks out there who are doing good work that they could connect to. All right. Let me just do this last little lesson that I learned. One of the last lessons I learned was about the relationship between power and silence. History is the fruit of power. The ultimate impact of power exists in its invisibility. Our primary work is to unveil the roots of power, the operation of power in ways that we know how power is shaping the lives and the possibilities for the trajectory of the people who are living. How does power shape your life? Generally, we experience it invisibly. So power does two things. It operates invisibly, and it forces certain groups and communities and people to operate in silence. So it creates silence, it invites silence, and it operates in silence. The primary work is to unveil the operation of power. And so the framework that I use to try to do all of this. This is a justice reconciliation framework, and I'm just going to blast through this really quickly so we can get to our two other presenters. Is this notion of an interwoven set of practices that shares their aim, the construction of identities that are radical. Radical being relationally constructed, authentic, dignified, interconnected, affirming, legitimated, and performatively co-equal. Glad to talk about any of that. Performatively co-equal is the justice component of that. Last digression, maybe. Quantum physics teaches us that we didn't understand physics earlier. We used to think that atomic structure, that atoms were unique, that they had a certain radius, that the electrons, the protons all existed within a certain sphere, distance from the nucleus, right? That was the earlier thinking. Quantum physics tells us that the best we can say now is that those atoms have probability, that it's probable that the electrons are within a certain distance or space. You can project the probability, but that they're not anywhere at any given time unless you take a picture, and when you take a picture, you fix it, and it limits the possibility. In that moment, it becomes a thing, and it's only that. But then in any other moment, it can become something else. What does that actually say about us? It means that we are constructed with the material of infinite possibility, but when we categorize one another, we limit what those possibilities are. And usually the disciplines that we operate in cause us to fix and see people in a particular way. And so our work is to move towards this humanity 3.0, more relationally networked, interdependent kind of existence, right? That's the work that we're trying to do. And how does that work happen? This is the last piece. It happens through declaration. We have to be willing to declare a real possibility, fight for the vision that we've declared, and then live into that possibility, right? So July 4th, 1776, there was a declaration which suggested that we would do better as a country if we were separated from the realm of the king. And then, in order to move into that vision, because it wasn't true when we said it, the Declaration of Independence was not true. It was stated as a possibility. We had to be willing to fight for that possibility and move into it. In 1863, January 1st, 1863, there was a declaration which suggested that all people, regardless of their place of origin, should be allowed to live free, and that their children should not exist in perpetual bondage. In order to live that declaration out, in order to live that vision out, we had to fight for it and then live into it. We're still living into it to some extent. August 28th, 1963, there was a declaration that harkened back to the original two declarations, which said all people should have fundamentally full and equal access to the resources and opportunities that they need to survive, thrive, and make full contribution. And then we had to go to something that felt like a war in order to live into that vision. And then in July 2010, Alicia Garza, watching George Zimmerman be acquitted for killing Trayvon Martin, with a broken heart, she wrote a letter, a little email. It said, "Black people, I love you. I love us. Our lives matter." Patrice Couleur saw that, put a hashtag to it, and said, "Black Lives Matter." That's a declaration that we're trying to live into, but it seems as though we have gone back to war around that declaration. If it is a vision that you believe is worth living into, we're going to have to push through this fight and continue to live into it. And this is the thing. We can find our way into that fight and through that fight together. And if we don't, it is likely that one of these communities, somebody is going to order the barbecue. Connie.